excited to have this conversation. Oh, thanks, Anna. Really excited to have this conversation and really thrilled with the guests we have joining us to share about their work and their insights about arts, culture, and the SDGs. Before we get started, I am going to pass it over to my colleague Paige for a land acknowledgement.
As Emily noted, my name is Paige, and I just want to begin our discussion today by acknowledging that 10C shared space resides on and recognizes that it exists on the ancestral and current lands of the Attawattaran, Mississaugas of the Credit, Haudenosaunee, and Métis. I'm thankful for those who have nurtured and continue to nurture the land that we call home. When recognizing our home and where we live, a conversation that we must all acknowledge during this time is connection. Connection to the land, connection to our communities, connection to our elders, and connection to ourselves. We recognize that we are within the treaty lands of Treaty 3 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, and will continue to uphold this agreement through our work. The Dish represents our responsibility to share and care for this land, its resources, and its people. It's important that as we gather today and find connection and learning in this virtual gathering, that we continue to promote Indigenous perspectives and worldviews and continue to learn about the reconciliation process when we leave here today.
Thanks so much for that, Paige. So I'm just going to share my screen here and we'll get going. So is that screen presentation showing up for everyone? Looks good? Okay, you never know with these things. Okay, so yeah, thanks again, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Excited to have this conversation about arts, culture, and the SDGs. My name is Emily Hansen, and I'm the SDG Cities co-lead based at 10C Shared Space in Guelph. And I just wanted to start off by introducing our project, SDG Cities. So the SDG Cities project is a collaborative project of 10C Shared Space in Guelph and the Pillar Nonprofit Network in London. And SDG Cities really aims to support local action for the SDGs through community conversations like this one, through training, research, and network support. And our project is funded by the federal government Sustainable Development Goals program. So today we're going to be talking about the SDGs and sort of in the context of arts and culture. And we're going to start just with an introduction of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, maybe for those who aren't familiar, and then talk a little bit about arts and culture and sort of that connection. And then we'll hear from our amazing panelists and then have time for discussion and questions from all of you. And I know that we have folks joining sort of from all over, from Guelph, from London, maybe from elsewhere. So if you have a minute while we get going here, just to introduce yourselves in the chat, let us know where you're calling in from. That would be awesome. It would give sort of us and the panelists a sense of where folks are coming from. Okay, so first I'm going to talk a little bit about the SDGs and kind of introduce the SDGs to folks. There may be some who are familiar and some who aren't, so this is just going to be really brief and kind of an overview. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals are a global agenda for sustainable inclusive development adopted in 2015, and they were ratified by all 193 UN member states. And the vision of the SDGs is really based around an idea that achieving these ambitious global goals would have a transformational impact on the world. During the period when the goals were being developed, there was broad community consultation with nearly 8 million people worldwide. And the result of that engagement are these 17 goals that you see on the screen. And during this consultation process, there were over 300 issues raised related to human health, equality, the environment, and economic prosperity. And all those issues and even more are kind of captured within these 17 goals. So the SDGs are not the first global development agenda that we've seen. As an example, the MDGs, or the Millennium Development Goals, came before. So they were developed in the year 2000 and are kind of a precursor to the SDGs. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how sort of the SDGs are unique and different in a few ways. So first of all, the SDGs are universal. Unlike the MDGs, which focused on providing support for less developed countries, the SDGs are a global call to action for all countries. And they really recognize that issues like poverty, hunger, climate change, these things exist everywhere, and they can really only be addressed through a universal effort, and with focus from all countries. The SDGs are define sustainability by connecting environmental, economic, and social dimensions. The framework is also supported by a set of connected and robust targets and indicators. So this really means that the SDGs provide the targets for achieving the goals, and they can also help us measure our progress. And finally, the SDGs are universal and comprehensive, acting as a sort of shared language that can help us break down silos between places as the goals apply to all communities and countries, as well as the planet as a whole. We can also break down silos between issues, as the SDGs include 17 goals, 169 targets, and these are all really interconnected and indivisible. They also break down silos between sectors, because we know that the success of the SDGs requires participation across all sectors. And finally, between people, because the SDGs require inclusiveness and participation from diverse groups. So kind of in a nutshell, when we think about the SDGs, they're really a shared language or a common way of understanding the challenges we face. They're a blueprint that can show us what we need to achieve and how we can get there. And they're a tool to help us measure and assess our progress. I also want to acknowledge that the SDGs aren't perfect. We'll be talking about that a little bit today. This type of high-level development agenda has the potential to reinforce power imbalances. So the principle of equity becomes really important so that those experiencing challenges can express leadership and self-determination and be a part of the solution, be a part of the solutions being developed. The SDGs are also an international framework, and the translation of the goals into local contexts can be challenging and really requires sort of buy-in and awareness at the community level. The SDGs are also complex. They represent a really broad range of issues, so it can be challenging to sort of focus in on and understand where you can make a difference, particularly locally. And finally, we know that there are some blind spots within the SDG framework. For example, the needs of Indigenous peoples are rarely addressed explicitly in the goals. We also live in a world that's changing really rapidly, and the framework, which was developed in 2015, has some blind spots. So when we think about this today, particularly in the context of the pandemic, so we're living in a world in 2022 that's very different than it was in 2015. And also a lot of the emerging and important social justice issues that we're kind of addressing today. There are also many other blind spots in the framework that we know are really critical for achieving sustainable development, and arts and culture is one of those. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that context. So yeah, as I mentioned, arts and culture is a bit of a blind spot in the SDGs, but I'm going to talk about this in a bit more context. So when we talk about sustainability and the way sustainability is defined within the SDGs, we often see depictions like the one shown on the left with the 3 pillars of sustainability: society, economy, and the environment. And as I mentioned, this is the framework that sort of underpins the SDGs, this idea of sustainability. And in SDG language, it's often referred to as people, planet, and prosperity, or the 3 Ps. But it's been recognized that culture is sort of a missing and critical 4th pillar of sustainable development, incorporating things like well-being, creativity, diversity, innovation, and many other important facets of inclusive sustainable development. I wanted to share this, a policy statement from United Cities and Local Governments, which is a coalition of local governments and communities that they were really arguing for reimagining how we think about sustainable development to fully integrate these cultural dimensions. So this policy statement says, a vision of sustainable development with 3 dimensions was developed in the second half of the 1980s. These dimensions alone cannot possibly reflect the complexity of current society. Many voices are calling for the inclusion of culture in the sustainable development model, since culture ultimately shapes what we mean by development and determines how people act in the world. As a part of this policy statement, they also talked about how this approach to sustainable development that considered culture would critically include development and investment in a cultural sector and ensuring that culture had a place in public policy development. And I noted the date here. So this policy statement was issued in 2010. And at this time, the UN and other global stakeholders were thinking forward to what would come after the Millennium Development Goals. So this is essentially sort of the development period of the SDGs. And given that the MDGs didn't have a really strong cultural component, a lot of stakeholders were thinking forward to what a new global agenda could look like that included these sort of dimensions of culture. And I just wanted to share this. This is from another coalition of groups that was doing a lot of advocacy during the development of the SDGs for consideration of arts and culture as sort of an important component. And this campaign was called The Future We Want Includes Culture. And the work of this campaign really stressed the need to mainstream cultural aspects in future approaches to sustainable development. And they also included reference to targets and measurement frameworks when thinking about cultural dimensions. So even though we saw some of these advocacy efforts during development of the SDGs, there aren't that many references to arts and culture in the global SDG framework, particularly when you start to dig down to the targets and the indicators. While arts and culture aren't featured strongly, we know that the sector can and will play a really important role in achieving the SDGs. For example, arts and culture participation can improve overall health and well-being. Arts and culture can play an important role in inclusive and sustainable communities. Arts can be a tool for people to learn about and connect on the issues that matter. Arts can make our cities and our communities more inclusive and accessible. Arts and culture can foster entrepreneurship and innovation. And these are just a few, and we can really make these kind of connections all across the 17 goals. So when we talk about arts and culture as a key factor in achieving the SDGs, there's a lot of opportunity locally. So localization of the SDGs refers to the process of defining, implementing, and monitoring strategies at the local level to help us achieve the SDGs. And localization can include all kinds of activities like storytelling, community impact measurement, collaboration and partnership development, policy change, tools and resource sharing. This is all sort of part of localization. So I wanted to include this slide to kind of help us think as we talk to some folks who are working locally, we can start to think about what the opportunities locally can be to include arts and culture in our SDG work. I'm just going to skip over that one. Okay. Now we've gotten to the time where we're going to hear from our panelists, and we're really excited for the group that we have joining us. We're going to have our panelists sort of present one after the other, and we're going to save comments and questions to the end. So if you have any comments and questions, you can share those in the chat, and we'll try and get to them at the end. But we're just going to have sort of our panelists go one after the other. And I'll introduce each. So I think we'll start with Sarah. So Sarah Haanstra works at the Guelph Community Health Center, where she manages Toward Common Ground. And she is also the interim primary health director. In her role with Toward Common Ground, Sarah led the development of a local well-being framework that guides the work and focus of Toward Common Ground. She has also led many projects focused on understanding local needs and impact. So that's enough for me. I'll turn it over to Sarah for the next little bit. And I'll stop sharing here.
Thanks, Emily. I'm going to screen share, and we have about 10 minutes. Is that right?
That'd be great.
Myself
Yeah.
a timer. Okay. So I'm just gonna share my screen and hope to get it into presentation mode easily. Just give me 1 second here. You can tell me if I did it right or it flipped. Is it right? The right side, not the note side?
Yeah, looks good,
Yeah.
Sarah.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for having me here today. I'm going to talk a bit about measuring well-being through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals and what that could mean for the arts. I myself, I don't identify as an artist myself. My work is more in kind of social services and healthcare. I do identify as someone who loves to experience and be a part of the arts, and in sort of as a person who enjoys music and other types of things. But my work mostly is in healthcare and social services. So the lens that I bring today is around that measurement piece and how it can be applied to the arts. So as you heard in my bio, Toward Common Ground developed this well-being framework 5 or 6 years ago. And without worrying too much about the fine detail, the concept behind it is that health and well-being is holistic, and that any one piece of our health and well-being influences another piece. And so when we think about, and actually I'll talk about it a little bit later on, but when we think about participation in the arts as an artist, as a person who participates as a, I don't know that I want to say the word consumer, but I don't know that that's the right word, but a person who, experiences and appreciates other people's art, that has impacts on our health and well-being. Our access to the arts and to those experiences have impact on our health and well-being, and that has ripple effects across both our experience as individuals, but also our experience in community and as communities. So this lives in the background. We were funded to sort of build out 5 of these bubbles. And so there's 3 more, which are environment, transportation, leisure, and culture, which encompasses arts and culture, where we have sort of some background on it, but we just, our focus has really been on those kind of social and health pieces. So today I'm going to talk very briefly about the Sustainable Development Goals, just as context for the rest of the presentation. Emily already did that well, and I learned from Emily, and now I know a little bit more in terms of the history, so thanks for that. Then I'm going to talk a bit about results-based accountability as just a frame or a way to think about how the SDGs can apply or not apply at a local level, and what that might look like. And then the impact of the arts from the lens of what the literature tells us, and then a bit about how you might go ahead, move forward to measure impact. So this was on a screen already, maybe twice. This might be the 3rd time. So you've seen this. These are the Sustainable Development Goals. When you look at them more closely, you could argue that the arts might have an impact on multiple. I pulled out 3. The first one, maybe very obviously, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning, and then even the concept of productive employment and decent work. There are more. I just put 3 on here, with the idea that participating in or experiencing experiencing arts and culture, and the interventions and the projects that go alongside that can, and I would argue do, have an impact on these broader sustainable development goals. This concept of results-based accountability is not my own. It comes from somebody named Mark Friedman. It's used as a way to understand how to measure impact of the interventions that we might lead or the projects we might lead. The reason that I share it here is because sometimes when we look at sustainable development goals, they feel very like high level, and it's sort of sometimes hard to get our heads around. So how does my initiative, my work, my participation in the arts actually influence these broader sustainable development goals? And is it even worthwhile to make that connection? I would argue that sometimes it is worthwhile for reasons like it's to tell a story to funders or others that we want to take note and to understand the value and the impact. And sometimes it's worthwhile when we look at the work that we do alongside the many other interventions in the community, and we think, is what I'm doing having an impact? And if it is, what is it? And then what does that look like alongside others who are doing similar work? So I would argue that the SDGs, or the population accountability, they're what we would call population health measures or goals. They're very high level. Emily described them as universal. Sometimes when things are universal, they miss the nuance of more diverse experiences. So they're sort of at that really high level. But then when we go ahead and measure what we do, we can actually sort of bring that down and look at kind of the nuances and the particulars of the piece of work that we do. So I would argue that if you're thinking about measurement in terms of the arts, in terms of a project or an initiative, that you're at this, and this comes from kind of that healthcare social servicey world. So we say client populations, but you could say residents or participants or community members. And I think I may have changed it actually for a future slide. So we think about, or I think about the potential for the SDGs in terms of a frame or an umbrella that sits above, provides direction for the things that you might measure at the intervention or the project level. Some of my work really focuses on the concepts of resilience and protective factors. I use this picture a lot, and then I thought it was really appropriate for today, partly because of the idea of kind of the arts as a bigger initiative, a bigger movement, a bigger community, and also just art, like a little girl who's clearly just, look at the big smile on her face because she's I don't know what she's done, possibly rolled in some paint, but possibly decided to just paint herself, whatever it is. But that connection to that activity clearly has put a huge smile on her face. So resilience in the work that I do, and I talk about resilience at a community and an individual level, and I think that's really important because the two go hand in hand, and they don't neither of them happen without the other. But the resilience is the ability to successfully adapt to adversity and maintain well-being. It's the idea that we're able to respond in the face of difficult times. And protective factors are the positive supports or resources that promote resilience, the things that are in our community that in our community, but also in our lives, that are protective in difficult times. And the reason why I use this frame is because when I think about measuring the arts, and then I think about the literature on resilience and protective factors, I would argue that the arts are a protective factor for individuals and community. And what I have listed here, the literature tells us are protective factors. They are protective factors for children, for adults, for families, for communities. So a sense of belonging is a protective factor. When we feel that we belong, that's one buffer when we face difficult times, because we know that we're connected to more than ourselves, we're connected to our community. An identity, or in some cases it's called a power identity, but the concept that we have a place where we know that we shine, not because we're the best, but it's the place where we just feel that we can do what we love to do. We can be in the moment of it all. We have that identity. And sometimes that can be, you may have an identity as an artist, but you may have an identity in terms of your gender and your race and your culture. All those things are part of our identity. And we know, many people have multiple intersecting experiences and as well intersecting identities. But that's a protective factor, to feel sort of that you can stand in that connection to others and to community, similar to sense of belonging, sort of that, but those individual kind of connections, safe and supportive communities, and safe and supportive nurturing relationships. Again, that those sense of being with people and being with community, positive mental health, the concept of flow, so this experience of complete absorption in the present moment. So being in the moment of either a creator of art, a participant, someone experiencing art, and when you're just in it in your brain. Those are that's connected to positive mental health. All of those things are protective factors. They're protective for us in difficult times. So when we think about measurement, then we know the literature tells us that those things matter. And we also know that the arts and the experience in the arts are connected to those protective factors. So I would sort of, when I'm thinking about that, back to that kind of population health level, when we look here, so this concept of measuring the arts, I would say you're thinking about the SDG at that community level, at that broader, community population level. You're thinking about your own initiative, and you're thinking, what is it about my initiative or my project that makes a difference? And it could be lots. Like I gave a few kind of list of things there that the literature tells us are important for well-being, that are connected to experiences with art. That list could have been much longer, but I didn't want my font to be, 7 size font, so I kept it to that list. So when we think about all of that, and you think about measurement, one frame that can be helpful is the idea of how much did we do, how well did we do, is anyone better off? So that is anyone, so how much do we do is like, so I'm going to say it in terms of you're running a program. How many people came to the program? How well did we do it? Is like the survey you ask, oh, you know, was the time of this right? Did you have fun? And then is anyone better off? Is like, did this actually make a difference in people's lives? That's the measurement piece that we, I think that I would argue matters the most. It's also the measurement piece that's often hardest to measure. When we ask, is anyone better off? We can think about some of the things that we know are important to well-being that act as protective factors. And you know, if you think that your intervention, your project has a role to play in that, you might ask people about that experience. Did you feel connected to people, or did you meet somebody new that you didn't know before? So we understand sort of people's participation has maybe connected them to somebody that they weren't connected to before, or even just the general experience. Was this a good experience for you? Did you leave, you know, in a feeling positive when you left? Those kinds of things. Oh, my timer's going off, so that's my 10 minutes. I'm going to quickly wrap up here. So then operationalizing, so I gave you a few concepts, the concept of population health, the concept of SDGs being up here, kind of an umbrella, the concept of a program being a piece of many different pieces that are working toward SDGs, and then the measurement being around figuring out, is anyone sort of better off, or did we make a difference? That being connected to the concept of protective factors and resilience, the literature tells us are important and act as buffers in times of adversity. So with all of that in mind, then you might apply that, operationalize it. You might sort of be like, what does this look like in practice? So I just made a few quick suggestions. I'll actually go to the next slide because it's because I'm right at the end here. So in order to do that, you might ask yourself the question, what SDGs does our initiative align with? So you go through and sort of say, and I think all of them will align to the one about well-being. What is your research question? So what do you want to know in order that aligns with that? And the question you might ask is, to what degree did this art initiative, this was an example, increase the sense of belonging, community belonging? So you think, okay, this is a place for people to connect and build relationships. I think that this intervention might make a difference there. And I know that community belonging is essential to health and well-being. So I'm making the connection to the SDG. Who is the audience for your findings? Maybe it's funders, maybe it's program leads because you want to know about your impact, maybe it's participants. What indicators will show progress toward your intended impact? So maybe you'll do a survey and you'll collect information about self-reported sense of belonging or connection. Maybe you'll ask for an arts-based or self-reported submission. Maybe you'll ask people to actually apply what they've learned in the program to tell their story of the impact of the program. Your methods, I'm in a bit of a box with my methods. I was saying this earlier today. I often think of things like surveys and interviews. But maybe you would ask for an arts-based submission from your participants, and then your analysis and interpretation, descriptive summary of your survey, but maybe you would co-create that or design that with your participants. So you'd actually weave the evaluation into the intervention and let participants decide how they might want to share or analyze information. And then whenever I think about collecting information about impact, I think about knowledge mobilization. How might we share that with the world? And so I just, you know, one-page summary, maybe your group would say, hey, we want to actually embed the evaluation into the actual initiative or program that we were a part of. I know I'm past time, so I'm going to stop sharing. I had questions, but I think we'll leave that for later. So that is me from the lens of measurement, applying that to the arts, and I'm looking forward to hearing what others have to say. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Thanks for sharing those. I like to sort of, we can start there and kind of move and hear some other perspectives. That's great. And if there are questions for Sarah or any of the other participants, feel free to just pop those in the chat as we go, and we can get to them at the end. But I think we'll move on to our next presenter. So our next presenter is Jessa Agilo, who is the founder, president, and CEO of Artspond, a federally registered charity that aims to strengthen the potential of artistic expression to nurture healthy human ecosystems that cultivate equity and social cohesion by boosting spatial, economic, digital, and accessibility justice and other urgent systemic issues in underserved communities across Canada. Jessa is an integrated arts creator, producer, educator, knowledge seeker, change maker, and serial social entrepreneur with a 3-decade career boosting social, spatial, economic, digital, and accessibility justice with, by, and for equity-seeking groups. So welcome, Jessa. We're so thrilled to have you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. Just to clarify, we're a not-for-profit, we're not a charity. Artspond et just to clarify that. So I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll just dive in, and I'm noting the time, so I'll stay within 10 minutes. So hiya there, salut, bonjour, atalahai. Thank you. I'm very honored and delighted to be here to share a little bit about my story and the work that I'm doing with so many beautiful, wonderful, inspiring people in the arts and culture community across Canada. So today I want to talk a little bit about what I see as the paradox and the possibility of trying to find connections between arts and culture and the SDGs from my own experience and my perspective. And I have kind of 3 agenda items, like, okay, what are those paradoxes and possibilities? What is that? Why are there paradoxes and possibilities from my perspective? And how am I trying to either honor them, respect them, or challenge them? So just very, very briefly, a little bit of my life and story in this world. So what is this idea of the paradox and possibility of connecting arts to the SDGs? Well, there is a paradox between art for art's sake, which is a very long history. It's a beautifully important history of just making art for art's sake. But there's also a growing movement going back to the 60s, but I think we could push it back much, much further, about art for social change. And the SDGs are calling upon the arts community, and perhaps we have not been activated historically, say in the MDGs or the SDGs, or broader questions about how do we evaluate the role of arts in social change, because generally artists are not seen outside of the arts as good leaders of social change conversation and initiative and effort. And people that are interested in social change don't necessarily understand what artists are talking about when we're talking about social change with, by, and for the arts. So there is this paradox of artists not being able to describe how they want to realize social change, what it is that they're fighting for, but also people who are more traditionally active in social change movements, in policy and funding and government and so on, not really seeing artists as positive leaders. And there's also a movement in the funding realm to invest more money in art for social change. And I think this is generally a positive evolution, but we don't want to lose the value and the investment in art for art. Artists just making art. We don't have to, actually David Meggs through the Metcalf Foundation just like 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, wrote a short blog article in response to a symposium that Canadian Heritage hosted. And he asked 3 questions. Can art meaningfully involve itself in society without becoming a tool of our social agendas? Can we stick to the integrity of our artistic processes without dismissing our responsibilities to the present moment? And you summarize this paradox by asking the question, how do the arts continue to do what they do best, i.e. making art for art's sake, while growing ever nearer to the urgencies of the day and the calls of the SDGs towards collective action, including the arts? This is the paradox and the possibility that I've been trying to live with in my work and with the community that I'm collaborating and partnering with. So why is there this paradox and possibility around this? Part of it, I think, is rooted in the precarity of artists. Historically, artists just don't have the capacity to be involved in social change movements because they're just struggling to survive, to make art, to pay their bills, and to become change makers at the same time and lead policy discussions and fight for funding and all of this. It's pulling them away from what they want to do, what they do best, as David Meggs described it. So there is this the reality of artists, their capacity to be involved in social change movements, the calls of the SDGs, in part, is restricted because of their precarity. And also this lack of appreciation of seeing as artists as positive leaders of social change movements. There's a lack of inclusion. The SDGs were not designed with culture at their heart, and they should have been. Culture should have been one of the key elements at the start. But no, the precariative arts workers say, why aren't you including culture in the SDGs? I think is part of the reason. So there is the opportunity, a possibility of greater inclusion of arts and culture in SDGs or whatever comes after SDGs. And I think there are three key elements that we need to look at. And I call them in the last, this is new, in the last 3 weeks, I've started calling them illumination, representation, and activation. Illumination is about understanding the potential of artists as positive deviants in our society and can really lead and vision a better way or a wiser way or a more impactful way, because I don't like the word best or better. And then representation is making sure that artists are at the table, not just in the arts community, but at the SDG table, at the government table, at policy discussion tables. The arts are represented and we are activated, we're given opportunities to lead the change that we collectively want to see. So I see illumination as positive deviants. I see representation as affinity engineers, artists who can facilitate a wider table, including with, by, and for the arts, a wider conversation about social change and how the SDGs can really bring it together. And then activation, I see it as care impresarios. People are building solutions, building communities that can realize the goals, the SDGs in particular. So there is, I think, again, this paradox and possibility of expanding how we understand the SDGs, both from the non-arts community and the arts community, but also evolving how we talk to each other. When we think about impact investors and how they understand impact and how they understand and evaluate the impact of their investments, whether it's financial or otherwise, and how artists talk about the value and impact of the arts, there's a real disconnect there. We're not talking the same language. And so I think there is a need for evolution of how impact investors and SDGs design the words and the choices that we decide is important and how we communicate them. And similarly, the arts need to get out of our arts language head and start looking at the SDGs and finding ways to use SDG language or broader social change, social innovation language to describe how what we're doing in the arts can meet traditional social innovation agendas. So I'm just going to very, very quickly in the last 3 minutes that I have, give some examples of how I'm trying to operationalize this in my organization. So our first decade is ending in 2023, and our first decade strategic plan was called Share Well, Vivre Bien. Vivre Bien in French is Share Well, Live Well. And we connected to 12 of the SDGs internally. Of the 17, we chose 12. And in our second decade, we want to get to about 14, I think. So I think that there are 14 of the 17 are deeply potentially connected to the arts sector. And I've listed the ones here. And we have 4 strategic areas in our first decade: social change, social justice, looking at say, Indigenous reconciliation, and tooling young leaders to become to build the more kind of equity, caring communities that we need to see socially. Spatial justice, looking at building more affordable, accessible, inclusive, spatial, actual like buildings. So we're building a land trust, or trying to. Digital and financial justice are 2 other areas. So I can just wind out by sharing a couple examples of the types of programs that we're doing. AHA, today's presentation is an example of our AHA program, where we're just talking about tooling the next generation to lead the change that we need to see. So we do a lot of, probably trained about 400 students from all the universities in Toronto over the last few years, including paid opportunities, internships for like a year to come in and work with us. Spatial justice, we had a collective impact project to try to understand the stories, the root causes, the ripple effects, and positive responses to gentrification in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. And out of that came a new project called Ground Trust, which is currently a feasibility study to establish a cultural land trust, which is very similar to community land trust, if you're familiar with that. Access Art is a kind of an ecosystem building project with people with disabilities, evaluating the lack of, or again, the kind of the dilemma and the positive, the opportunity and the paradox of public space being both accessible and inaccessible, and public art in particular. We're doing lots of projects around digital and around the financial side. I lost my gig as a mutual aid network for the pandemic. Arts United is a platform cooperative to try to support gig economy workers in the arts and culture sector. And our latest project together there is tied to digital justice, but we actually want it to become just equity justice in the future, where we're fighting for all of these social issues and trying to connect the arts and the SDGs together, all of them, or all 14 that we want to work towards. And I'll just give one example of where our new strategic plan is headed for 2014 and how we design our projects. So you'll see the 12 SDGs in the bottom left-hand corner under impact. There are 7 areas that we are trying to understand and illustrate how we work, both in terms of ecology and ecosystems, equity-seeking communities, the actual social justice, social, spatial, digital, et cetera, justice that we're fighting for, and various processes or wise practices that we entail to support specific cultures and communities. And so I just want to highlight here, this is an example of our Ground Trust and Ground Story project, where one is about knowledge building, trying to understand the root causes of the problem. So you'll see how they connect to our priorities in blue, kind of looks like a double I here. And on the right-hand side in green is, okay, it's our solution, the land trust. So we like our work for the SDGs is trying to understand the root causes, the ripple effects, how do they connect to specific SDGs, and then doing the solution to realize that. And that's how we work. All of our programming has this dyad or triad approach about building knowledge in order to act. And so I'll end there. I went over 2 minutes. Apologies for that. Thanks for your patience. And I look forward to your questions after.
That was great. Thank you so much, Jessa. I really liked you sharing that sort of visual representation of the knowledge, the action, and the impact. That was really helpful to kind of bring it all together. So now we have our last presenter, Michelle Peak. Michelle is the founder of Art Not Shame, a community-engaged, multidisciplinary arts organization serving youth and adults in Guelph and across Ontario. Michelle is a community-engaged educator and photographer. She's interested in the transformative role of art in community-based social justice projects and mental well-being. So welcome, Michelle, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. I'm just gonna also put on a timer for myself. Okay. Hi. So I just I'm gonna take a breath for a second. This is actually my second day back at work after a bit of an emergency leave. And so the gift of that time of being sort of rocked to your core is that you come back to yourself. The challenge is I feel a little bit like I've been catapulted into this moment. And so I share that sort of as a way of like honoring myself, but also sort of permission to not be okay, to come here as a full, whole human, imperfect, messy, and still get to engage and not have to choose between, you know, isolation and not engaging, but instead sort of, you know, come as we are. So maybe also a little invitation into this third space where we can just be, which I hope will be sort of a thread that weaves through what I'm about to take us through. So we are Art Not Shame, and to make a long story that, as you know, in a retrospective narrative becomes this like neat little trajectory that makes a lot of sense, but you know, was just sort of a following of intuition and sort of feeling into what was something that I could contribute into the world. Art Not Shame was birthed out of my own experience with trauma and loss, and sort of originated in the space of trying to make an intervention into the mental health world. Fast forward to 2017, what we fundamentally are trying to do is create a world where belonging is unconditional and creative practice is accessible, and that both of those things are recognized as fundamental to well-being and to community building and to possibilities for a just future. Everyone can see my slides, right? Okay, cool. So to narrow all that down, our mission is to use the arts to build community, deepen access to creativity, increase well-being, and create the conditions for inner and outer change. I'll just skip this one for the sake of time. So our deep purpose, then, we sort of think of these 4 pillars, and sorry, I should frame first that the SDGs are still somewhat fresh and new for me, and we won't have as an explicit a connection to those pieces, but what I hope this will offer is sort of a inside look of what the arts can do and can offer. So for us, our deep purpose centers around 4 pillars that are all interconnected. So one is to support participants in expressing their creative voice with just this deeply held belief that everybody is creative. To engage in community making through the arts, and we operate with the idea that the arts gives us a greater access to ourselves and to each other. And then to recognize that creativity and community are part of what makes us well, and to celebrate and welcome everything that makes us wonderfully and heartbreakingly human, which is, partially my sort of human introduction is to say that this is also the work that we're trying to do both in our projects, but also just in our way of being with one another in our cultural workspace. And then finally, to challenge systemic sources of shame, hence our name, Art Not Shame, as barriers to learning, self-acceptance, community building, with care and accountability. And that art is a vehicle for us to do that. Before I sort of touch on what I think the arts might be able to offer or give some examples, I realize that a lot of the time I speak with these like deeply held assumptions that I'm not sort of bringing to the surface. So I just want to sort of voice the assumptions that I carry with me, laden with all the biases that they will be laden with, but to sort of help you understand where I'm coming from and where Art Not Shame is coming from. So when I say the arts, while we employ professional artists and we have great respect and value for the arts in that sort of sense, but when I'm using the word arts, I'm not talking about the professionalization of the arts necessarily. Our specific work is in community-based arts, and even sort of stripping beneath that is in the idea that art and creativity is a way of being in the world that all of us have access to. So Sarah, I was thinking when you're saying you wouldn't call yourself a professional artist, we would be like, you are absolutely an artist and creative. But so I'm using the word art, but I don't. So I just want to be clear that I'm also speaking more generally to that like creative impulse, which links back to our principle or our deep purpose, to sort of help create spaces of belonging and welcome where people can express their creative impulse. Another assumption that I hold is that arts in the way that I've just described it are a vehicle for healing, for ceremony, for resilience. I just thought of this study. I don't know if folks are familiar with that study about the opposite of addiction is connection. There's a TED talk about this. Anyway, I can put it in the chat for if you're interested. But the idea that arts are also a vehicle for connecting us to ourselves and to each other, and that the role that plays in healing is really crucial, is another assumption that I hold. And then another thing that I think a lot about is sort of how we're in a crisis of belonging, and that belonging is based on sameness and white supremacy. And if we even think about like biodiversity, like diversity is an indicator of health. So I really like this quote that I came across recently. Perfectionism is a virus widespread in Western culture, which keeps us running on the treadmill of never enoughness. It is inherently deadening for how it strives, but never arrives. Failure is embedded in its very pursuit because humanity can never be homogenized. And yet we are constantly being harangued into sameness, the condition upon which our inclusion hinges. So there's an assumption there that I hold that links these ideas of perfectionism, sameness, white supremacy, inclusion that I think art has the potential to disentangle. Um, Another approach that I sort of like assumption that I bring to this is that the challenges identified by the SDG are spiritual and ideological as much as they are material. So one of the, I recently came across, I think it was on InnoWeave, this idea that it was sort of different examples, and it relates to the next point of scale, of how to scale change. And so related to that is the belief that transformation isn't possible without scaling deep. And by scaling deep, and these are the words from InnoWeave, I mean changing the hearts and minds of people, systems, or communities in terms of narratives, values, beliefs, and identities, so that the idea underlying the social innovation is supported and embedded. And so one thing I see when I just see these sort of lists of goals, and again, I just want to preface, like, that's not the work that I'm deep in. So there will be things that I'm missing here, but I'm hungry for like, where is the piece that is about that deep scaling, and what can facilitate that? And that's where I think arts would play a really interesting role. And then the last sort of assumption that I bring to this work is that relationships are everything, and that they start with definitions of the self. And so if we are approaching any of these goals from the perspective that the self is an individual entity responsible only for itself, completely sovereign from everything else, that is going to impact the how and the why and the what of what we're doing. And so how might the arts provide opportunity for a redefinition of self and self in relation, and what difference would that make? So like an example that just comes to mind is a friend of mine writes a lot about water and how we're all bodies of water. And just a simple idea that if we could sit in the belief that we are bodies of water, but not just a body, and then there's water over here, then how does that change how we operate in and through the world if we are bodies of water that contribute to and flow to other bodies of water? So that's what I mean by sort of the relational connections between things are sort of everything. And if we're starting all of this work from the idea that we are all individuals who are just going to like tick a bunch of boxes and do this work, but not sort of do the sort of parallel deep transformational work, then sort of where does that leave us? So flowing from there, what I think the arts can do are, and this is all very high level. I think it's similar to Sarah, like we have concept papers and research papers that can sort of give you the stats and the anecdotal evidence that says the arts will do this and they'll increase this by this. But sort of to bring that all back on a really high level, what I believe is that, and what our work I think tries to show, is that the arts engage the whole self. So our senses, feelings, bodies, memories, teachings, knowings, beliefs, they are a site of reintegration. So they bring into consciousness through process and play, not necessarily product or a sense of completion or ending. They bring into consciousness our interconnectedness. They integrate the parts of ourself that we may have severed, the self and other, self and nature. So again, to just think of a really quick example, I remember doing a photo shoot with someone who felt very disconnected from their body, and we together co-created these photographs where we were sort of shared the position of photographer. I tethered to a screen so that they could direct their own shoot and reimagined that relationship. And so even that internal severing, the arts has a role in sort of creating, or can have a role in creating change. And so that's what I mean by reintegration. And then likewise, that how then might that facilitate change for relationships or action that we're all working towards if that relationship is fundamentally different. And then finally, or the last two are just that, and Sarah touched on this already, but that meaning, purpose, and belonging are all, and that's sort of where I started in this work, but are all protective factors in mental health, but they're also what bring us back to ourselves and each other. And then I think what Jessa demonstrated in much more detail, way more articulate than I could hear, is that the arts can hold paradox and complexity. And those are sort of like going to be deeply rooted in the challenges of our time. So I do, and I can sort of gesture, that was 11 minutes. I think as everyone took 12, I might take one more minute, but I mean, I can share some really beautiful examples of projects. I don't think I have time to do that, but what I just came across, I forgot that we had done this. It's a bunch of people speaking to what they think the arts can do. So I'm just going to let them sort of speak. It's just a minute or two long, if that's okay. And I'll just play that now. Can you hear that? No, okay. I'm just going to stop sharing and share again with sound.
Okay.
Oops, sorry about that.
Art connects and
You hear?
heals. Art gives meaning.
Gives us community.
Gives me a voice.
Gives us access to the full breadth of what it means to be
gives
human.
us connection
Gives
and hope.
life texture.
Art gives us a voice.
Art heals.
Awareness and compassion.
Art gives us so much, and while it can be seen as something extra or a luxury, I believe it's much more fundamental.
It helps us cope, understand, and is a glimpse into others' lives.
Art is this universal language that allows us to and encourages us to relate to one another.
During this pandemic, I personally saw the way my students use art to express themselves and to stay mentally sane, and the way art sort of carried all of us through what could have been or has been difficult times.
And I think that art gives us an outlet, and art gives us exactly what people need to be hopeful, to be inspired, and to be sane during a time like this.
Art gives us a back doorway around someone's brain or intellect and allows us to meet them more at the heart level, which is sometimes where the deeper connection and those aha moments happen.
Caring for another's experience, I think, is a radical and important act, especially in these times of distance and division. I think art gives us the opportunity to connect to these possibilities outside of ourselves.
And most importantly, art has the power to shift our consciousness about who we think we are.
If life is a line, then art gives it bumps and curves and direction.
Arts gives us access to the full breadth of what it means to be human. Please support the arts.
Please support the arts.
I'll stop it before all the pleas to support the arts continue. But yeah, I just thought that was particularly relevant and beautiful to share in this context. And that is it for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michelle, and thanks for joining us and bringing all of that. And I liked some reference in the video to transformation, and you talked about transformation too. And I think that SDGs, when we look at sort of the vision that they're putting forward, it really is all about transformation. So recognizing that we need the arts and we need those cultural aspects to make that transformation. That was really great. Okay, so thanks to our panelists for sharing a bit about their work and bringing their perspectives. And now we just wanted to open it up for questions and discussion. So questions for the three panelists, or you can direct a question to one. And there was one question in the chat from Stephen. Stephen, I don't know if you wanted to ask your question, or I can read it as well. Did you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, how's it going? Yeah, for Sarah, I was just curious, there's been so much work done around social determinants of health as in relation to protective factors and so on. And I was wondering if you had any comments about connecting social determinants of health with SDGs as a way to get at the effectiveness of interventions, in this case, art interventions.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Stephen. I almost always start anything longer than 10-minute presentations with an overview of the social determinants of health. I often talk a bit more about experiences and how our experiences, both positive and adverse experiences, shape our lives. And then I also often talk a bit about equity and the concept of health equity. So mentioning social determinants of health, and I'll just drop a list in the chat for those. There are multiple lists of the social determinants of health. This one comes from our local Wellington, Dufferin, Guelph Public Health, but there's also a report called the Social Determinants of Health, the Canadian Facts, and their list is slightly different. But just for everyone on the call, the social determinants of health are the living conditions that impact our health and well-being, living conditions and experiences. And yes, I think there is an opportunity to make a connection here because of the literature on the social determinants of health and the ways that we know that they impact health and well-being. There's a direct crossover when you look at some of the SDGs. So, you know, from a strategic perspective, if this is about, in some cases, sharing the story of, or garnering support for, or in some cases, funding to be able to do some of the work, it might be strategic to connect to the social determinants of health. And in some cases, it just will make sense. So yes, the short answer is yes. And I think the bonus is that language is understood in certain sectors and by certain groups. And there's also the research behind the social determinants of health in terms of the direct connection to health and well-being. So yeah, my short answer is yes. My long answer I've already given you, so I'll wrap it up with that.
It's a bit of a nerdy question, but it seems to me that a lot of work has already been done, and we know that when we're taking action on social determinants of health, that good things are happening for the target group. And social determinants was really the first place I, as a musician, in addition to the being an evaluator, but I was interested to know that arts and culture and it was the first place I heard a kind of connection that if we take action on arts and culture at a population level, people are healthier. And so I'm really drawn to this, and I don't know why we don't, especially when it's a Canadian framework, and so much good work has been done to validate. The work has been done for us, is what I'm trying to say. If we're taking action on determinants of health, then we know good things are going to happen, and we don't have to make the argument, in this case, for the arts, that it's actually good for us. The data is there already. It's a convenient way to be persuasive in this case. So thanks for your comment. I appreciate it. Anybody that wants to talk about this, I'm down.
I maybe have a few things to say about it. I think like the social determinants, I think there are gaps about culture and about place and belonging. Like these things are important, really, is that mental health, like feeling like you belong and that you have a voice are very, very important to social determinants of health. And when we look at wider indexes, such as the Canadian Index of Well-being, there is leisure and culture there as a very important one. And when we look at even like arts and culture communities trying to come up with indexes, that they tend to be very quantitative in nature. Okay, it's counting the number of folks, not necessarily the quality of the experience or how they have been changed. And this is what I think arts can and should be contributing to. I actually have the Canadian Index of Well-being open on my other screen here. And under leisure and culture domain, they have dimensions of participation, perceptions, experiences, and opportunities. And there are some pretty nice traditional measures under participation, number of participants, ages, and so on. But under perceptions and experience, it says data gap. Like there's no measures there at all in terms of how the arts are concretely changing. Like it's for me, it's about like social innovation, social change, changing perceptions or changing experiences that we feel we belong more in society and want to contribute outside of making art. We want to go and we want to vote, or we want to make art about and protest at a march and show some of our art about what we're fighting for and what we believe in. There's so many things here that the arts can and could and maybe should be contributing to in terms of what might be important for these kinds of measures. The Statistics Canada, just a month ago in March, early April, and I just attended a webinar this morning about a new index of well-being. So if you go to search Statistics Canada Index Wellbeing, it's called the Quality of Life Hub, search Quality of Life Hub. And they're trying to make concrete connections between traditional indicators and the SDGs. And I think there's a need for the art sector to say, okay, there's culture statistics, let's make sure that we're connecting them to the SDGs as well. So a few ideas there.
Thanks so much, Jessa. I just shared that Quality of Life Hub link. Yeah, okay. And Nate, you had a question in the chat. Did you want to just ask your question or?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's pretty broad, but you know, I think we've been talking very theoretically all along here, and I'm just wondering if we can maybe brainstorm some like practical ways that arts organizations could maybe engage with the SDGs and maybe apply some of the content of them to their actual programming or their actual, I don't know if it's outreach or all the different things that organizations do, how they can tangibly engage with the SDGs in that kind of practical work.
I'd love to hear, sorry, go ahead, Michelle. I'd love to hear from you first.
Okay, you're going to have a much more direct answer, I think, than mine. But so I think many ways, first of all, like thematically, in terms of process, in terms of evaluation, all of those kinds of ways. But I also think I'm curious about what happens when we let the process and the participants lead and then see how that connects as opposed to the other way around. So I mean, this is just off the top of my head, but I'll share. Many of you will be familiar with this project that we did, the mural project, Art in Hard Times. But it was basically a community-led process in the very early stages of the pandemic, where we basically brought folks together from equity-seeking groups and said, and asked them what the shape and goals of the project should be. So we had an idea, and of course, you know, we also, none of this is perfect and all of it is deeply flawed because we exist in the system like everybody else. So we have to write grants and make a proposal and say what we're going to do. But then on the ground, we sort of work with participants from a very community-led place and say, what do you want the goals of this project to be? So for this particular one, it was reduce pandemic-related isolation and voice important messages to the world, which I could see reflected in a couple of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so together with a lead artist, they created this concept, this mural concept, based on conversations, surveys, feedback, and then refined it. And then the artist, but she's like magic, turned it into a paint by numbers. And from there, each of these sections of the mural had a theme that was created by the participants. It was like regeneration. It was like, actually, I could see a lot of them reflected. There was stuff around housing. There was stuff. So all of the goals, I think, probably if I look through it, most, if not all, were mentioned in some way by the participants. And so then they picked their section of the mural that they wanted to create it in with, fill in with whatever art form they chose, and we had sort of a mentorship set up. And then we helped them sort of scale it onto a piece of paper. Pick, like, each section was associated, sorry, my screen's over here, that's why I'm doing this, was associated with a color palette. And then from there, they had sort of their individual story, or the message they wanted to voice to the world, embedded in that piece. And then you can see sort of them broken up into smaller sections. So this was one of them. Like each piece contains its own story, its own wisdom, its own possibilities for a path forward, or for learning, or for community building. So these are just some examples of some of the stories that were contained within that larger piece. I won't sit here too long. You can go to our website to take a closer look at these. And then we go from this to this, which is a really, in my opinion, incredible visual depiction, I think, of all of what I was trying to say, where it's like the art can be the process, it can be the product, it can be the educational piece, it can be the thing that brings people together, like that gives a sense of community and belonging and voice and expression in ways that meet people where they're at. Like the sentence we used, which I borrowed from somewhere, and about, you know, we not only want to enact we not only want to envision the just future, we want to enact and create it. So it's also about the how of the art, which is why, again, I said, when I'm talking about arts, I'm not talking about, and this is not to cast judgment, but I'm not talking about training to be a professional ballerina. I'm talking about like, how do we create a space, our approach, like how do we create a space that honors and welcomes the whole human as they are, all of it, all of our piece, all of our sides, operates from a strength-based perspective, a healing-centered approach, and an equity-based approach. And what might we create from there? And this is the kind of thing that's possible. And none of this required special skill or necessarily access to specific, like high, expensive materials. Like you could do this with what you already have access to, which is also really powerful. So anyway, I'll stop because I could go on. And this project was incredible. We also had an artist witness, Joni, who watched the whole thing and then wrote 4 original songs in response to the project. And then, if you want to look at those, like, okay, how do we measure this? Like 92% agreed that they were able to express their feelings through art. 76% felt it was helpful in reducing social isolation. 81% agreed it allowed them to voice important messages through the world, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's my answer by way of an example.
I'm so glad if I think on behalf of everyone, I'm so glad she went first because that just blows my mind. Thank you for sharing that. I can't match that at all. That's the reason
Not true.
Is this kind of work needs to happen and needs to be shared more widely. But maybe I can add from my own perspective. Our arts organization is a service organization. We're an intermediary. We're trying to build capacity and knowledge and understanding to be able to do this kind of work. But I think there's a couple things the arts can do. One that we're trying to do. So broadly, I think the arts community can try to deconstruct the SDGs, to look at them, look at the indicators underneath them and pull them apart. Like the indicators underneath them, when you start looking at them, they're like, okay, SDG 1.1, 1.2, they're terrible. For the average person, they're great for governments, sure, and they're great for folks that are trying to change things at the national level or the international level, but they're really, really hard to apply to individuals or communities. There are a few exceptions, but trying to apply them in the arts sector, there's maybe 3 of all the sub-level indicators. So have a workshop. It's not necessarily fun, but for us geeky folks it is. Go to a cafe and one a week. First week, let's take SDG 1, look at the indicators and imagine and deconstruct them. What might the arts contribute for indicators under SDG 1? And then create our own evaluation frameworks based on that. Under all the, and I don't necessarily recommend we start with SDG 1, but we could prioritize the ones that are the most important. And then we can better track and share how we're actually enlivening these SDGs from our own point of view. So this for me is the evolving, but it's also it's expanding to a certain degree, but it's also evolving the framework to our own means. And perhaps there is an 18th dimension that should be added that's about culture and about belonging or about identity or cohesion, cultural cohesion or something like that. Like peace, justice, and strong institutions is trying to capture that, but it's so vague that it's really not hitting the nail on the head at all in any kind of way. So something that's about culture and cohesion and belonging, I think might be really a positive contribution, and we could make some quite profound sub-level indicators under those. So that's what I would suggest. And then what we are actually doing is trying to do that through software technology. We've received the most money of any organization in Canada, I'm proud to say, under Canada Council's Digital Strategy Fund for 5 projects. And one of them is an open source software platform that includes an impact investing component. And so we're trying to crowdsource impact practice framework that's focused on Indigenous and disability and racialized perspectives. And so over time, by crowdsourcing, oh, this is how I evaluate, this is what's important, these are the types of stories that I'm trying to say, and these were the questions that I asked in order to get at those stories, crowdsource those with permission and always honor where they come from, where the source of the wisdom comes from, to eventually have an alternative to the SDGs that is culture oriented. and culture-led and arts-led, using technology to crowdsource that. So hopefully that will, in 10 years, that'll be around, but it's time consuming, it's expensive, but that's what we're trying to do on our side. I'll activate that. But I'd actually love to just host some co-creation labs, intentional experimental in the park or something. Okay, SDG 2, what does it mean? And make some art about it and try and come up with some measures.
I just wanted to add too, oh, sorry, I'm talking over.
No, go ahead, Michelle.
I was gonna say, I don't really know how to do any, to me, I really have to hold myself accountable here. I'm using a very liberal definition of the arts to encompass a lot of things, but I don't know that you can do it in a decolonial way without encompassing the arts and culture and different ways of being and knowing in the world. So sometimes I use arts as a catch-all for that, because I think in some ways the arts are a Western concept, right? So there's something else that is what I'm talking about. But how do you, I don't know, how you can't disentangle, you can't move forward in a purely Western sort of framework of well-being and not replicate all kinds of harm that we're already sort of a mess in. And I think of during my studies, I learned a lot about the meaning of water in Hawaii for Kanaka Maoli. And there is this, even to describe it, and this is me having done months of research on it, and I can't even come close to it, but the interconnected web of relations in understanding the word water, the water flows from mountain to sea and organizes all kinds of kinship relationships, including the taro patches, which were, and these streams were diverted during colonization. We'll get somewhere, I promise, but were diverted during colonization. And maybe from if we were looking at these things in siloed approaches, it would be we could only understand the environmental impact of that. But the flow of water from mountain to sea that fed the taro, that made the poi, that was a part of a staple of the Hawaiian diet, which is, and the plant itself considered in a spiritual sense, a cousin, or a cousin to the Hawaiian people. You can't disentangle all of those things. It's all connected. So yeah, to me, but when I see all those things, and I know, and again, this is me also, I don't know, I know you introduced this whole thing by saying it's complex and interconnected, and I don't know the extent to which the work sort of engages that, but to me, access to the arts and other ways of knowing and being is what can make space for, get out of the way for us not to just do more damage by severing things. I'm sort of on a rant some of this stuff, so I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Michelle. Sarah, did you have something to add?
I was just going to add just a couple of thoughts, just back to Nate's question, how can arts orgs engage with the SDGs and try to target some of them in their programming? First of all, I want to say when Jessa and Michelle presented, I was like, oh, I wish I went third. I think I would have just taken it in a whole other direction. It was really lovely to listen to both of you, and I learned a lot just sort of sitting back in my chair and listening to your words. And so I feel grateful that I could be third on this question, because this is my one shot at following the two of you. But I would just say a couple of thoughts. So I think about the SDGs. And I thought, Michelle, you gave a really good example of how it could actually play out in a co-created, kind of co-designed way. I would say, finding a way to look at the SDGs and sort of which are the ones that we could apply in our context. And you can apply them in the context, I think, of your approach of how you consider and think about accessibility to the art, the program, the initiative, the space that you are creating. I think of the decent work one in terms of, even when you are thinking about artists and the role that they play in creating art and the connection to decent work. And so that is actually about your approach. It's not necessarily about it's about lots of things, but it's not, it's about the foundational pieces of a program or an initiative or a place where artists are valued and are able to create art and to actually be paid an income that is considered an income that is adequate. And then I think about it in your activities and your impact. So then when you get to the impact piece, the question I would ask is, what about this program and what are the outcomes that we think are part of influencing SDG A, B, and C that we've now identified? always knowing that the work that you do and the efforts that you put in are alongside the work and efforts of many others, right? So if you're thinking of any one SDG, which can feel very global and very broad, you are one influencer, so to speak, or you are affecting change in your sphere of influence, which is the people or the communities, those that are connected to the work that you're doing. So I think of it in a bit of a linear way, sort of like which ones do we think apply? Then how do they apply? Do they apply in how we operate, how we go about our business, how we make an argument for components in our in our funding application, then the activities that we choose, and then the impact piece. And Michelle had some good examples of measures that I think you could directly apply to an SDG if you just make the connection when you asked your participants to what degree did you experience a sense of, a decreased sense of isolation. That has a direct connection to multiple SDGs. And then you just have to, Jessa, you talked about the language not always aligning, you have to make the direct connection. Like sometimes I write a lot of grant applications and I often, this means that. Why do I write that? Because I know what it means, but people reading it or I'm telling the story don't necessarily know what it means just because it's in my brain and it seems obvious. So I do a lot of that. Like this means that this program had an impact on this person's sense of isolation, which is directly connected to their well-being, which is SDG number 1. That's the way that I would sort of, tell the story and draw the thread.
Thanks so much for that. And I think connecting it back to the practical, like what are we going to do, how are we going to take these conversations forward and apply them is really impactful. So we have a little bit of time left, 7 minutes. Are there any other questions or comments from you folks listening in? And feel free to raise a hand or unmute to ask your question. Okay, I don't see any other questions. I wanted to not ask a question or sort of bring up a point for discussion. And I think each one of you talked a little bit about storytelling and the stories and how we share those. And I wondered if maybe I can start with Sarah. I know that Guelph's community plan includes some art dimensions, and you're involved in some work developing a measurement framework for that community plan. And I'm wondering if the storytelling piece, the piece about creativity and shared storytelling, if you could talk a little bit about how that connects art and the SDGs.
Sure, I'm looking at the time, so I'll try to be quick on this. So I am working with the City of Guelph to identify indicators or data sources or stories or something else to be determined by people like you who have ideas in terms of telling the story of our community related to the 7 theme areas that have been identified through the community plan as important in terms of health and well-being for people that live and work in the City of Guelph, but I would argue and beyond. So that piece is actually, and I honestly, this is an open invitation to reach out to me. We just had a meeting about it this morning. We're looking definitely at some of those data points that people like, the numbers, the statistics, the percent of the population that fill in the blank. But we're also really wanting to create another part of this storytelling that is outside of the box in terms of what might be in my brain about the ways that we share information about our community. So that's to be developed, Emily, and we are hoping to convene an advisory committee in the fall that will help with that. What I imagine, again, like I feel like there's something outside of the realm of my imagination, but that's why I always say, I don't know what I don't know, and we'll figure this out. But really what we're committed to is the concept that data and numbers have a place and they tell a certain story and they miss a whole lot as well. And are there other ways that we can help understand kind of the story of our community that look different? And they may be arts-based, they may be storytelling, they may be other things. So if you have ideas, I would love to hear from you. I would also love to hear from you if you're familiar with the kind of data that is available and exists related to arts and culture and the impact, because we're also trying to figure that piece out. So it was more questions and answers, Emily. Sorry about that, but yeah, it's out there and we're thinking about it, and we're hoping to do it in a different kind of innovative ways in terms of the storytelling piece.
Is there a chance for even folks to, like, because I'm in a blunt kind of mood, but basically if the arts are going to be involved, to like sort of advise and sort of support on even how and pay and stuff like that. Like I'd be happy to offer advice, or share experience, I shouldn't say advice, on that. We've been on the receiving end of so many requests where it's like, we want to do this and include the arts, here's $2,000. And it's at the end of the project and do a million things with it. And you're just like,
well, first of all,
I know you wouldn't do that.
When you said, is there, I was going to say, stop. Yes, the answer is yes. We're early in the, but the piece around, we are very early in the process. So yes. And I'm sort of leading it on behalf of the city, but I do work within, if you know, the capacity of the time, time and sort of time limits and people power in the background in terms of doing some of the coordinating. But I would absolutely love to connect with you and anyone else on the screen, because like I keep saying, I don't know what I don't know, right? So the only way I'll know is by talking to you and others. So yes, the short answer is yes, and we're not at the end of the process. So I can promise you that it won't be at the very end, because we're at the beginning. So sooner than later, I'd love to connect.
Cool.
Thanks so much for that. And I'm just recognizing the time, and I think maybe that's a great sort of ending point. We know that there's work to do. There's more connections to be made, and I loved Jessa's idea about getting together in the park and deconstructing the SDGs. Thinking about what they mean locally, really with our project SDG Cities, and with this conversation about SDGs and the arts, we want to hear from folks who are deep in this work, and we want to think about like what it means locally here in Guelph and in London, where we have partners who are also doing this deep work. So I'm really sort of excited and energized by this conversation, and really want to thank Sarah and Michelle and Jessa for so graciously sharing and kind of kicking this off. And I look forward to more of these conversations coming. And I wanted to just direct folks to sdgcities.ca, which is our project website, and we'll share some of the insights from this session, and we'll continue to share. I know there was lots of notes and projects and links that were shared during the chat, so I was jotting some of them down, so I'll try and share those back as well, so folks have kind of a comprehensive package of the resources. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to our panelists, and thanks to everyone for joining, and looking forward to more conversations like this one. So thanks everyone. I hope you have a great evening.